Good afternoon. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn on Indigenous Food Lab, and thank you for joining us. My name is Nikki Hanger, and I am the Forestry Program Coordinator at the St. Croix River Association. Before we begin, I will let Deb introduce herself.
Thanks, Nikki. I'm Deb Ryan, everyone. I'm the Executive Director for the St. Croix River Association. The St. Croix River Association is the official nonprofit partner of the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway, a unit of the National Park Service. SCRA is dedicated to protecting, restoring, and celebrating the St. Croix River and its watershed. We're a nonprofit organization, and we depend on the support of individuals and businesses throughout the watershed to carry out our vital mission. If you're inspired by our work today, please consider becoming a member, volunteering, or participating at one of our upcoming events, and sharing SCRA with your friends and family. For those of you who are already members, we sure do thank you.
Great. Before we begin, we would like to take a few moments to talk about the Zoom software. Please leave your camera off and remain on mute for the entire webinar. You can type your questions in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. I see some of you are already typing, so that is great to see where you guys are all from. We will answer questions after the presentation, but feel free to type them throughout the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and a link sent out in the next few days. The recording will also be available to view on the St. Croix River Association's YouTube channel. As we move into questions towards the end of the presentation, we will put a survey in the chat box. Please take 3 minutes to fill out the survey. This will help us determine future Lunch and Learn topics and let us know how we are doing. Today, we will have a talk about the Indigenous Food Lab. Our presenter today is Dr. Armando Medinaceli. Dr. Armando is a Bolivian ethnobiologist with extensive experience collaborating with Indigenous peoples in Bolivia, Mexico, and Guatemala, as well as teaching at undergraduate and graduate levels in the United States and Bolivia. He has over 15 years of experience working in ethnobiology, ethics, Indigenous foodways, and food sovereignty, biocultural diversity, sustainability, climate change, community conservation, collaborative video, and more. As the Indigenous Education Director at NATIFS, he works on the design, coordination, and implementation of the organization's education and research programs. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Armando Medinaceli. Please feel free to share your screen at this point. Great, yep, I see the screen.
And can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. I hope everybody else can as well. Okay, so thanks for this. Thanks for the invitation. I'm excited to be here and yeah, to share a little bit of our work, but I also thought I'll share a little bit of overall experiences that I had in the past that led me to this work and how we are implementing our work and all of it. And here at Indigenous Food Lab, that it's, as you're gonna see later, I'll explain a little more. The Indigenous Food Lab, it's the main project, if you want, from NATIFS, that it's the main organization that I work with, which is North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. But anyway, so I wanna talk about food in general, because all our work, most of our work relates, it's surrounded about food and indigenous foods in general. So to start this, I want to start with a simple question to you that might not seem very simple to some of you, maybe. I don't know, it's not. Okay, so I think there it is. So my simple question is, what is culture? I wanted to start with this because I think culture, it's one of these these ideas that I think most of us have a good idea, or we believe that we have a good idea of what it is, but it's kind of hard to explain. If I ask this to anybody, usually people have a little bit of trouble explaining what it is. We know what it is, but it's hard to explain, you know? So, and I want to start with this because this is a very important part of our work. So this is like a very simplified image to give you an idea of what culture is. Culture is like this conglomerate of different things that includes obviously language, includes food, includes like the traditions, includes our music, our art, and many other things. But of course, two of the most important components of culture are the language, obviously, and the other one is food. And that is why I wanted to start with this, understanding culture. I want to make sure that we all know that culture is something that we learn. It's something that it has the symbols, and more importantly, it's something that is dynamic. So that means that culture is constantly adapting to new times, to new environments, and it's changing. So it is something dynamic. It's not something static that we just have and that's it. It's something that we are constantly developing through a process of enculturation. We are learning every day more about our own culture and stuff like that. So obviously culture is integrated on our everyday lives, you know, and it's shaping who we are. It represents who we are, our identities. And it's also very importantly to know that culture is shared by a group of people, and it's passed from generation to generation, right? So that's how we understand culture generally. So as I said, one of the big components of culture is food. Now, talking about food, I have another quick question for you. I was wondering if you ever ask yourself this: why do we eat what we eat? And it sounds maybe like a silly question, but it's something really interesting to think about, you know, when you think like why some people in some parts of the world eat things like this, other parts of the world eat things like that, that you can see there are some shared ingredients even, but the way they are presented is very different. In other parts of the world, they eat like this. And other parts of the world eat things like that, that maybe, I don't know if you recognize that or not, all of these meals and everything. But that's one interesting thing is to understand that as humans, we are omnivores. That means that we can eat everything, right? That our organisms is capable of processing all types of foods, many different things. So as humans, it's interesting to think, why don't we eat the same things? You know, because if we have the same biological capacity to process everything, why do we eat differently in different parts of the world and stuff like that? So as part of that, this is the link that we have between food and culture, that it's something really important. So if I show you this list, for instance, and could you tell me, or can you think like which one of these is food for you? You can read that list, like cheese, or rotten shark flesh, or buffalo peanut stew, or oysters, or chairo, that probably you don't even know what that means, or spiders, or monkeys, or a hamburger, or a biryani. So all of these, which one of these, or how many of those are considered food to you, and how others are not, and why? That's something really interesting to think about. And it depends, you know, it depends. To answer this, to see which one is food, it really depends on one big thing, and that is culture, right? Because depending on your culture, depending where you come from, depending on your traditions, your beliefs, and your surroundings and all of that, some of these things might seem like food to you or might represent some type of food, and some others might not. So that's, again, that's the important close relationship between food and culture. And when we talk about food in my work here at NATIFS and Indigenous Food Lab, we're working in the concept of foodways. So we're not just talking about food as the things that we eat, and that's it. So to understand foodways, I gathered a couple of definitions here that are very simple for all of you to read. Like this comes just from a basic dictionary that says foodways are the eating habits and culinary practices of people in a region and a historical period. So just by that simple definition, you can tell that when we talk about foodways, we're not just talking about the things we eat. We're talking a little more than that, right? So if you are interested, here's what the Urban Dictionary says. So it's a little more complex, and it's just saying that it's trying to define it in a way explaining that foodways are not just what we eat or what we don't eat, but it's also how do we eat it? What are the traditions, the history that are surrounding all those things that we eat? And if we want to be a little more, I don't know, professional or more specific, in the social sciences, foodways are understood as the cultural, social, and economic practices relating to the production and consumption of food. So you can tell now that this is a very holistic view, you know, very broad view of food. So we're talking about how do we produce it, how do we eat it, but how that has important relevance in our culture, how that represents our social connections, social status even, and how that affects even our economic practices and all that. So that is what foodways are. This is what we're working on. So when we talk about in foodways in our work, we're talking about this holistic view of food in general. So understanding a little bit about the concept of foodways, we can now say that foodways are actually culturally constructed because they are part of culture and culture is defining it, right? So foodways are going to be having this representations of the culture based on the cultural beliefs and stuff like that, but also culture is going to dictate certain rules about this and certain etiquette as well about everything that we know as food. So some of the rules that culture is dictating are going to tell us, like, for instance, if we talk about Native Americans or indigenous people around the world in general, these rules are going to regulate what animals people should be hunting, what plants they should be growing, which plants they shouldn't be, but also what times are good ones for hunting, for planting, and also dictating certain rules of how to share some of these, how to prepare, how to cook them, and also how to eat the food, because not everybody eats them the same way. We have different eating practices and all of that. So again, these rules are culturally constructed. And of course, they're going to be different between societies, right? Because we are different groups of people, depending on our environments and our traditions and our beliefs and our customs, we develop new ways of, or different ways to interact with our environment, therefore to interact with our foods as well. So foodways also communicate a very important symbolic meaning. They are really, really important. There are certain foods that can unite people when they're together, or symbolically they can connect them when they're separated. Like, for instance, if I show you this picture, which is the chairo, one of the foods that I listed before, that maybe to you didn't make any sense. And now you can see that it's a soup, but I don't know, maybe for some of you it looks like a nice soup, delicious soup, or maybe not, but it's just a soup for most of you probably, right? But for me personally, it's way more than that. If I see a plate like that, especially this chairo, this is a representation of my country, of my culture. It represents in a way my identity, who I am, you know? It brings me thoughts, it connects me directly with my family, even though I'm really far away from them, you know? And it represents this love that I have for my family, for my country, for the local ingredients that I can see there in that soup, you know, the local tastes and how this soup makes me feel every time I eat it. And like, I think so much about my grandma and my aunt, especially because they're the experts on making this and whatever, you know. So this is one way how food also communicate this symbolic meaning. It's so important. So food is something really powerful. So, but food also can communicate division, right? And unequal power relations as well. Like, for instance, something like this, that what you see in the picture, you're not going to find that in a fast food restaurant, or you're not going to find in a, like a street market, or in just like the neighborhood grocery store or something, unless it's a very fancy one or something, you know? So that also shows a little bit how culture, it's telling us, it's creating this idea that there are certain foods that are dividing us in a way, that only some people can have access to them, you know, for different reasons and stuff like that. So food has that power as well. Also, foodways can mark social boundaries and identities. For instance, if you see something like that in the picture on the right, maybe to some of you looks like a little bit, I don't know, a bunch of rocks or something, you know. But again, that personally, to me, that looks like something super delicious. You know, it's one of the things that I really enjoy, that I really like, and it's something really important. And it separates me a little bit from other people because I understand what this is, and I understand how it tastes and everything, what it means for me, right? That is, it's called chuño, and it's dehydrated potato, basically, that goes through a process of freezing and all of other processes to become like that. The potatoes, specific potatoes, certain varieties that go through this process to become this. And it's a perfect way to store it for years if you want, without refrigeration or anything like that. And it's very common in my country, obviously, in the high Andes in general, in Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador. But now the eating practices also can mark these social boundaries and identities, the way we eat, the way we approach the actual act of eating, you know. In some cases, some people use things like that, you know, like chopsticks. Some others use utensils. Some others don't use anything, you know, and that also sometimes means something. We assign meaning to those things, you know. Those kind of things can represent or separate groups, ethnic groups, or it can represent the regional differences or even the class status in some certain cases, you know. So all of that, it's just because of food. Food is doing all of that. And food, same as culture, is also dynamic. So what that means that we, as people, we are different cultures around the world that are constantly integrating new foods and practices into their own foodways all the time. And that is something really important for us to make sure people understand, because when we talk and we're working about indigenous foods and indigenous ingredients, that doesn't mean that it's something from the past, that it was one way and it has to be the same way forever. It can be adapting. It's been dynamic. It's been adjusting constantly and accommodating to different realities and all of that. But at the same time, if a diet works and it provides the proper nutrition and sustenance, and more importantly, the cultural meaning that you have and you assign to this particular food, then it's very unlikely that you're going to drop everything and whenever something new comes along, you know. So that's why a lot of the indigenous ingredients, indigenous foods are still prevalent around the world, not only here in the US, but pretty much everywhere. Now, one of the things that it's trying to, in a way, it's been for a long time trying to change that a little bit, is this whole idea, this whole process of globalization in agriculture, you know, especially in intensive or industrial agriculture, are fueling major changes in foodways around the world, because they are trying for a long time to impose certain foods to everybody, you know. And because of that, they've been restricting certain other foods to some people. In many cases around the world, restricting some of the indigenous ingredients that are super healthy, but at the same time, that are like culturally relevant, really important for all the people. And they are losing access to those things because of globalization, because of agriculture. And that the type of industrial agriculture we have nowadays as well, we also know that has like really, really important, mainly bad influences in the environment. It's having a bad effect in the health of us, all of us, of the people, you know. So that's something to consider as well. And one of the things that is causing is the loss of indigenous food access, like I just mentioned. So in many parts of the world, indigenous people are struggling more and more to be able to access to their own foods, you know. And because of that, also like the people in the westernized world, in the globalized world, are kind of losing connection with all these indigenous ingredients. And they have, a lot of people, they have completely lost connection. They don't even know what's indigenous to their region. What are the proper foods, the culturally relevant foods, the more nutritional ways, or the more ecological ways to eat locally and all of that. Fairly recent, there's been some attempts and stuff to try to fight a little bit these movements, like the fair trade, for instance, that can be also controversial. It's a really good idea, really good attempt to try to start bridging a little bit these two worlds of indigenous food or local food with everybody else in a way that it's fair, that it's favorable for everybody, but it has its complications as well along the way. Now, I decided that I thought, like, to understand a little bit like indigenous foods in general, I'm gonna take you in a little tour of what I've been doing in the past. As at the beginning, they said, when they introduced me very nicely, they said, I am from Bolivia. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about the indigenous foods in Bolivia that I've been exposed for a long time. But also I was fortunate enough to live for a few years in Mexico. And I lived and had some work done also in Guatemala, and as well here in the US. And I also lived in Europe in a couple of places, but it was more difficult to get connected with the indigenous foods in those areas for obvious reasons. But in these other 4 countries where I lived, I had worked in all of them and had spent a lot of time with indigenous peoples and being really in close contact with indigenous food. So I'm going to share a little bit of this troubles that I had based on the food. So first in Bolivia, I'm going to divide it in two, the high and the lowlands. So we're going to start with the highlands. Like I showed you before, this type of soup that it's based on grains, like very interesting grains that some of them that you are getting more familiar with. Now, quinoa is becoming very, very popular around here. And you know, it's like a superfood, it's a super healthy grain. It's really delicious. That grows in very arid areas, usually in high altitude and specific requirements in the soil that it's a wonderful thing because it grows in soils that are not very rich, but it grows this amazing grain, you know, that's super healthy. And we have some other grains like tarwi that it's similar to, kind of similar to quinoa, but it's a slightly different one as well. We obviously have a lot of potatoes. We have many, many varieties. We have over 300 varieties of potatoes in the high Andes. That potatoes are originally between Peru and Bolivia. So we have so many different varieties. So we eat a lot of that as well in the high Andes. And we also eat a lot of wild meat. Like for instance, llamas, alpacas. That's something that it's not like extremely common nowadays, but it's in the certain areas, it's still fairly common to eat some llamas and alpacas, and the meat is really good. It's really healthy. It's very delicious because these animals are eating naturally. They're not being fed with nothing chemical or anything. They just roam around the land and just eat the grasses and everything that grow naturally in those areas. So it makes it really, really good. And also we have a lot of dry foods as well. Like I showed you those rock-looking things that are called chuño, but also we have charque, which is like the jerky that you are familiar here in the US. So it's dried meat, usually dried with salt and exposed to the sun. And that's a perfectly good way to store meat, you know. So it's really important for indigenous people in the high Andes to find ways to store this because a lot of my country is still very rural. So a lot of those places, they still don't have refrigeration or anything. So these traditional ways of keeping the food, they are really, really important for them. So that way they can have food all the time. Now, if we go to the lowlands, in the lowlands, there are a little bit of a difference. Mainly fresh and green foods. And when I'm talking about the lowlands in Bolivia, most of my experience working there is in Amazonia with indigenous people in Amazonia. So we were exposed to a lot of these fresh and green foods, like plantains that you can eat them like that, like in the picture. They're very, very green. You can fry them, you can boil them, you can do different things with it. You have like amazing, delicious fruit. I put a picture of passion fruit because maybe some of you are familiar with it. That comes from those type of environment, very tropical environment. Then there are some roots as well that are very common in the lowlands, like this one in the picture that it's cassava. That I don't know if everybody's very familiar with cassava. If you're not very familiar with it, probably you are familiar with tapioca. Tapioca is actually extracted from cassava. So that's where tapioca comes from. But anyway, so this is a root that is native to Amazonia and grows in that area. And it's, I was working in some villages, very small villages. And as part of the work, we were studying a little bit this root, and they, based on their own traditions and their own traditional ecological knowledge, they were able to identify 14 different varieties of this root, which was something fascinating. I didn't know that there was that many. When I was growing up, I always knew that there was only 2, but once I got to that place, I realized there's 14 of them, which is really cool. And also wild meats. Wild meats are also something really important because a really good source of protein. In Amazonia, obviously, you'll find like a lot of delicious fish on the rivers, but also different other types of animals, you know, like from wild peccaries and these big rodents as well, like paca and others, and agoutis, but also things like monkeys are an important source of protein from those areas as well. That again, maybe to some of you that sounds kind of weird and kind of impressive or disgusting even, but again, based on the culture is dictating in this particular case that is an important source of protein for them, you know. Then as I mentioned, I lived and worked in Mexico. I worked with mainly with a group called Chinanteco. So when I was with them, working with them, obviously I was exposed to corn, many varieties of corn. And that was something really interesting as well, because again, you start learning a little bit and realizing that there's so many different varieties of corn that sometimes we just think there's one or two or maybe three, but there's like more than 25 or something like that in just one region where I was working, you know. Then also they use a lot of beans and wild herbs. And that was something really interesting for me, a really good experience for me, because I was living in this village and every day we were eating tortillas and a bowl of beans like you see in the picture. And sometimes they included some wild herbs like you see in the picture on the right. And every day was the same thing. And I was worried that I was going to get tired of the same thing every day, you know, because I was, I don't know, coming from Bolivia and working in Amazonia, eating all this diversity of things. I was thinking like, I don't know about this. I don't know how am I going to feel. But after a month or so, I realized that every morning I was waking up like craving desperately my bowl of beans. You know, you never get tired of this. And also because they sometimes have different varieties of beans, they have different ways of prepare it. And the herbs, the wild herbs that they eat, there were so many different wild herbs that just adding a little bit or a bunch of them changes so much the whole meal, and it adds so many goodness to it, you know, a lot of minerals and vitamins and things like that that are really healthy for you as well. And obviously there's a lot of chilies, a lot of spices, and I was fortunate enough also that while I spent almost 3 years there, I was mainly based in Oaxaca. So I was exposed to delicious black mole. And that's another thing that it's a fascinating thing that it's a recipe that it could vary from between 6 to up to like 35 different ingredients just to make the mole sauce, you know. So it's something really cool to understand, to learn a little bit all the spices that go into making that particular thing. And it was very commonly eaten in the villages where I was working with indigenous people over there in different ways, you know, like you see in the picture with rice and chicken sometimes, but in many other cases it was made into tamales or different other preparations as well. And obviously they get some animal protein as well in that area from wild animals, you know. In this case, the paca that you can see in the picture, that it's a rodent, but it's like the meat is really good, it's really delicious, and it's a very interesting play that they have, because this animal loves eating their corn and their beans. So they are controlling while they're growing their corn, they have to control from this animal to attack their corn. But one way of controlling it is by hunting it and eating it. So there's like a really interesting balance there as well. So they're maintaining a really good balance in the whole environment with it. And also I was exposed to eating a lot more insects. I did try a couple of insects living back in Bolivia and everything, but not as many as I tried in Mexico. And they're not as common in the city. Even in the cities, you can go to the market and just find like these bags of crickets that you can buy, different sizes, different shapes, that are just toasted, and you can just sprinkle them over your tacos or eat them in many different ways. And it's something really delicious. And of course, there's like a lot of vitamins and proteins in those things as well. Then I spent some time in Guatemala, which was very interesting because I thought it was going to be very similar than Mexico, but it was similar in the ingredients, but the way they prepare the things are a little bit different. And that's what it shows a little bit how culture is changing certain things, you know. In this area in Guatemala, I work with an indigenous group that are called the Maya Quechí. And the way they use their corn, it's a little bit different. Even their tortillas, they have tortillas that's very similar than Mexico, that the Chinanteco, for instance, but the tortillas with the Chinanteco in Mexico, they're really big. In Guatemala, they're very small and they're a lot thicker. So just that, it's a big difference, that it's just based on their cultural practices, they decide to do that. They eat from my experience, they eat a lot more tamales than they eat in Mexico. And they make them a little bit different as well. They put some spices and stuff that are very particular to the region. So that separates it a little bit as well from Mexico. But again, the ingredients are very similar. In this case, the beans, of course, and a lot of herbs. And some of the herbs were very different because where I was, it was a very different environment. When where I lived in Mexico, I was in a mountainous forest, but here in Guatemala, I was in the lowlands in a very tropical forest. So the environment's a little bit different. So the type of herbs and stuff that they were eating that are available are different as well. Obviously, a lot of spices, chilies as well. Not as many chilies, and the food is not as spicy as it is in Mexico. It's very different. And a lot of cacao where I was working, which was wonderful for me because it's just delicious to have cacao there to just suck on the seeds and then like do the whole process to make some chocolate and stuff like that. And of course, there's another source of protein are wild animals. You know, wild animals are always really relevant. In this case, this is another type of rodent, an agouti, that it's also very important for in their diet, you know. Then here in the US, I've been living in the US for a long time now, many years. And when I first came, I started realizing a lot of the interesting things, interesting foods, indigenous foods also around here. Like for instance, same, like a lot of variety of corn, but then like an immense variety of squashes and pumpkins and stuff that I didn't know that there's that many variety, and they look so beautiful and so colorful and all of that, you know. But also I realized that, again, when I first came to the US more than 12 years ago, I wasn't sure like what kind of other proteins Native Americans consume and stuff. And then little by little, I started learning, and I was able to try a lot of bison and elk and moose and things like that, which is also fascinating. And then now I'm here in Minnesota, and I was learning a lot about wild rice, and I'm like really in touch with it and like consuming it quite a bit because it's something really wonderful, really delicious, really nutritious, really good, you know. And also, like, I was fortunate enough I lived, I think, in like 6 different states now, and some in the East Coast, some of the Pacific Northwest, and now here in the Midwest. So I was able to try different types of things. And one of the things that I encounter is that variety and diversity of berries that you have in this country. And I met with different indigenous groups in the East Coast. I was fortunate enough to meet with Piscataway, or I'm not really sure how to pronounce that name, and so I apologize. Piscataway people that lived in Southern Maryland. But then I was working and living for a little while in Washington State, where I was encountering different type of berries. Now I'm here in Minnesota, and I'm finding different type of berries that the Dakota or the Anishinaabe people are consuming. It's just a fascinating thing. So now then I decided at some point, every once in a while, I like to do this, to compare a little bit my experiences. Every time I'm traveling to a different area, I spend some good time and exposure to indigenous groups, indigenous foods. I like to think a little bit about the differences and the similarities of this. And it's really interesting to see that, like, when you can find some differences, obviously, on the ingredients. Of course, that's going to be based mainly on the environment that you are. Like I said, I was in the high Andes, then Amazonia, and then the mountains forest in Mexico, now here in the US. So obviously, ingredients are going to vary because of that. Also, something that varies are the modes of preparation and cooking. Like I was saying, even in places that they share similar ingredients, the way they eat them, the way they cook them are very different. Like I was telling you, the way they prepare the beans using different herbs and stuff in Mexico was very different than in Guatemala, for instance. But also the way they use corn, make it into tortillas and stuff like that. While in Amazonia, for instance, they also use corn, but they don't make tortillas at all. The main use of corn is to make it into chicha, which is this alcoholic drink that they really like in that region. So they're consuming the product, but in a very different way. So the ways of preparation, the way of cooking are very different. And the eating habits as well. In some areas, they're gonna eat in specific times on the day. Some others, they just eat like randomly, or they get together to eat. Some others, not as much. So there are like different ways, you know. And like, again, in Mexico, for instance, how everything they eat is with the tortilla. The tortillas are actually their utensils to eat. While in Amazonia, they don't. They just use sometimes some leaves from some plants, and they use those as utensils. They don't eat them. They don't eat the leaves. They just use them as utensil, like a spoon or something. And so, like, very different things. But then at the same time, there's a lot of very interesting and important similarities. Like for instance, in general, there's a very, very balanced diet. Usually they are eating very nutritional food, very healthy food, but very healthy not only for the humans, but also for their environment. The way they're eating, the way, because they're so in tune with their culture, they're so in tune with their foodways, they have a very sustainable way of practicing and approaching to their food. You know, they grow enough for their consumption, and that's all they do. They don't, in many places, in all the places that I worked, I never seen like overhunting, for instance, because they have their own cultural regulations about it. They don't allow themselves to overhunt or to overfish or to overharvest certain things or to grow too much of something, you know. Then also another thing that is really important is the spiritual connection that they have with their food and with their environment in general. You know, there's such an important connection with it that they all acknowledge that Mother Nature, La Pachamama, is offering you all these things. So you have to be very respectful to it and very thankful. And because of that, make sure that you're using it the right way and use it everything as much as possible. So even if they hunt an animal, they don't just eat the meat and that's it. You know, many parts of the animal, or all parts of the animal usually are used for different things, you know, even, and this applies pretty much to every indigenous culture around the world. You know, here in the US, obviously it's the same thing, like they eat an animal, but then they use some parts of it as medicine, or some other parts can be used to make crafts or to make certain ornaments or different things that you can use for different things. You know, it's something, a very, very interesting connection that you create. And a lot of the times it's based on this spirituality, that they understand that we are related to everything. You know, we are in relationship with everything that is living, and that includes the living and the non-living things, including the rocks, including water, including plants, animals, and everything. So this connection, it's so important, that helps you understand why they are so connected with it and why they create, based on those beliefs and everything, a more sustainable way of living in general. And overall, I saw that there's like a very interesting and beautiful relationship, a beautiful idea related to the happiness that it's related to the food. The way they relate to food is a beautiful way, you know, because sometimes it's really hard to get some of the food. Like I've been doing a lot of studies about traditional hunting and stuff like that in Amazonia, and it's really complicated, really a pain to engage in that practice and hunt an animal and then be able to use it and eat it and all of that. But they do it with such joy, even if they're unsuccessful in a hunt excursion or something. They just have this happiness related to food that is really amazing. And I see that everywhere. Here in the US, same thing. When I was in the San Juan Islands in Washington State, I could meet some people there that, like, when they go and fish and then they prepare their foods, or when they forage some plants, some berries and stuff, they have almost like a ritualistic way of doing it, that it's like such a beautiful thing, such a beautiful connection that you create with your food, and it really makes you happy the way to interact that way, instead of like the average person now in the Western world, that the connection we have with food is just on the grocery store. So it doesn't really give us any real sense of happiness, I don't think. But now another similarity that is a little bit not very exciting is that how all of them, they have this limited or restricted access to indigenous foods. I was telling you all these beautiful experiences that I had, that I've seen, and it sounds so wonderful, but all of them, they are struggling with it nowadays, because now there are other regulations. A lot of the indigenous groups that I work with, they are living within the limits of national parks or some kind of organization, or some type of land that it's managed by the government or some other organization or something. So there are certain regulations that are limit them or restrict them from hunting or from growing certain things, or growing their own corn in Mexico, for instance, which is really complicated. Or there are, again, based on globalization and stuff like that, there are other products that are being imposed and being grown in their lands, replacing some of their own traditional ways of growing food and stuff, and that's creating a big problem. But anyway, so I'm telling you all of this because now I want to focus a little bit more in North America. Like, I was telling you like how this beautiful connection the indigenous people have with their environment and everything, and it makes sense. If you think about North America alone, you can see in this map, these are all the ecoregions of North America. That means that every color basically is a different type of environment, kind of like an own little microclimate or something with different type of soils and stuff like that. And Native Americans, they have a good understanding of this traditionally. And that's why they are growing certain things, not everything they want, because they know what kind of things are going to work in that region. And that's why also their diets are so good, because they understanding these patterns, these different ecoregions and stuff, these different environments. They know that they can grow different things and they can share with other groups. Like I said, foodways are dynamic, you know, part of this sharing and connecting with other groups and incorporating new foods to your diet and everything. That's part of what foodways are. So that's why they eat so healthy, they eat so good. And there's like, we could be growing so many different things here in North America that are super healthy, that are gonna be way better for the environment, way better for the health of all humans in general, because we have this diversity of ecoregions. So we could select what to grow in certain areas and have like a more complete kind of local diet if we wanted to. And this is just an example of some of the North American ingredients that come from this part of the world, you know, and obviously you can recognize so many of them. There are so many interesting things. We can have like such delicious meals just based on this. And most of these ingredients are what we're using these days in our work, you know, and in the Indigenous Food Lab. Again, relating to this connection with the environment, with your food, is how North American indigenous agriculture was developed in this part, in this type of way. This is one example of it, the Three Sister Mound. The mound system, that it totally makes sense for the environment, because while you're growing these three different plants, you create a little bit of a microclimate right there, and micro ecosystem, if you want, that it's kind of feeding itself and protecting itself from pests and all of that, and it grows everything really well, you know. So it totally makes sense. It's something that it's not degrading the soil. It's something really beautiful. So in today's world, using this, what would it mean? So what are the benefits of talking about this indigenous foods and an indigenous diet? So when we talk about this, we're talking about healthy fats, healthy and diverse proteins, low carb, low salt, a lot of different plants, organic agriculture, celebrating cultural and regional diversity, and also regional and seasonal based food systems. You know, so it's pretty much everything we all hope to have at some point. You know, like have like really healthy food and everything. Something that is really beneficial, not only for our health, but also for our environment, you know, for our surrounding and everything. And those are the benefits of an indigenous diet. So that shows a little bit that knowing about your plants, knowing about your environment, understanding what you have in your surroundings, it's something so powerful. You know, it's a plant knowledge. Basically, it's just really, really powerful. So this is something that we like to follow in our work. This is a statement of, if you control your food, you can control your destiny. So if you understand the importance of these indigenous food systems, these foodways and the local ingredients and everything, you can control what you want to eat. You can control your destiny in a sense, you know. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit why I was telling you all of that. Now, why I was telling you all of that because my work at NATIFS, we are aiming to educate people about the importance of indigenous and local foods, as well as we want to try to create a research process and collaborations to contribute to regain access to indigenous, local, and healthy foods. That's like our overall mission, if you want, of the organization. And this is kind of how we developed our model for the foundations of an indigenous food system. So incorporating all this very holistic view of things, you know, incorporating the indigenous wisdom, the animals, the plants, and all other elements, removing this colonized way of thinking, removing colonized ingredients even, and understanding the importance of the spirituality, and also the importance of sharing all this knowledge that everybody has, and we can contribute to a healthy way of understanding food in general. So at work at NATIFS, within NATIFS, our main project, if you want, like the highlight that we have right now, it's what we call the Indigenous Food Lab, which is located in the Midtown Global Market in Minneapolis. So you're more than welcome to come visit. It's a kitchen that it's functioning kitchen that it's running, developing different things. So that's the Indigenous Food Lab. And now I'm going to give you an example of the kind of things we've been doing at the Indigenous Food Lab. We're working with indigenous recipes. So we have staff, about 14, 15 chefs, and 95% of them are Native Americans, working only with indigenous ingredients and developing new indigenous recipes as well. And for instance, the Indigenous Food Lab is started, we opened it in August last year, so it's very new. And between August and November, we engaged in a program in which we were developing these meals, like you can see in the picture, to be distributed to different people struggling because of struggling with food access because of COVID and that whole situation that we are on still. So as part of that project, we developed, or we were able to produce about 12,900 bowls of food that were distributed to different Native American communities, as well as some of the homeless encampments and stuff like that as well. And but yeah, it's something that it's been working really well for us, and it's something really important. And we obviously are working with volunteers, which is something really, really important for us and really useful as well. Because without volunteers, we wouldn't be able to do all the work we need to be doing. Then from November to February, we've been working in other, we switched gears a little bit. And we started working on, oops, I don't know what happened, I'm sorry. Okay, I hope you get to see that. So from November till February, we switched gears and we switched into a different program for which we are producing indigenous soups, developing again these recipes based on indigenous ingredients and creating all these soups like you can see in both pictures. With this, we are supporting 9 of the 11 Native American tribes in Minnesota. So we were producing these meals and distributing them. And that was a lot of work because so far between November and February, we produced about 78, almost 79,000 soups. So we were producing almost at a rate of 10,000 soups a week, which was a lot of work. And because of that, also, we were very thankful to work with volunteers. It's extremely important, that work, because they help us mainly packing the food, like you can see in the picture on the left. And because it's a lot of work to produce so much food. And this is a program that it's slowed down a little bit right now, but we are starting to, based on funding and stuff, it's very likely we're gonna revamp it in the next couple of weeks. Right now, we are producing a rate about 2,000 meals a week. So it's very likely we're going to go up again very soon. So you're more than welcome to join us and help volunteer if you want, or if you just want to come and just take a look. And obviously, we are following all the requirements like to prevent COVID, of course. So we are socially distancing, we're wearing masks, we have all the hand sanitizer, we're taking temperature measurements and all that kind of stuff, obviously. But anyway, besides just producing the meals, we thought like, we don't want to just send the food and that's it. Like I said, I am working on the education research department. So we said we should be incorporating more than just the food. So we decided to work on this one sheet insert. This is just 2 examples of them that we are sending every week along with the meals, in which we share a little bit of information about us, about our work, but also about the ingredients that they're eating. Also about the foods that we're preparing, and different other little bits of information that we think could be very useful for the people receiving this food. And also right now, currently, I'm working on developing on a very simple recipe booklet in which we're going to include all the recipes that were used for this program. So towards the end of the spring, we're aiming to send that recipe booklet to everybody who received the food, so they can, if they have their favorites or something, now they can actually make them, they can cook them and they have the recipes. So that's another thing that we're working on as education. But as part of the education department, also we're developing certain material educational material for different ages. Like for instance, these two pictures here, these are two booklets that we created that we are using on guest lectures or giving like short courses, short classes to elementary school kids especially. And we have different versions for middle school and high school as well. But these are the two that we're using right now, and we are working on some more. Right now we are in the final process of finishing one booklet that focuses on berries. Like you can see, the first one focuses on all about the different squashes and the varieties, the diversity of squashes, the indigenous names of it, how are the traditional ways of using them, and all of that. The one on wild rice focuses exclusively on wild rice, of course, but talking again about the history about it, the traditional ways of using it and how to get access to it and all of that. So like I said, we are in the final process of another booklet on berries, and we are starting working on one on corn, and we're going to be working on more little by little. But again, like I said, we just started with this last August, September kind of. So we are very new, and we're trying to do as much as we can. But also we're doing a little more. You know, we are offering these workshops, internal and external workshops. Internal workshops are workshops that I'm developing for our own staff. So we are having every once in a while certain types of workshops for our own staff to keep learning, to keep advancing. We are all here to learn and share, but also we are offering some of these workshops to other people that want, organizations and everything. We've been participating, offering presentations. We participated in some conferences. We've been invited to some regional meetings in different topics related to food, indigenous foodways, food sovereignty, sustainability, and other topics like that that we are working on. Like I said, we've been giving these guest lectures to elementary, middle, and high schools, but also to some universities in which we were sharing a lot of the experience we have in our work and all the things that we're working on. Then we organized and participated, invited also in certain panels and other conversations, such as this one as well, of course. And we're also developing digital material. We have already developed a few short videos that are focusing on certain ingredients and how to use them, how to cook them. We are in the process of developing a podcast in which we can engage in a conversation about indigenous foods and indigenous food sovereignty and all those kind of things, and how those things relate to the bigger topics of sustainability and climate change and all of that as well. And based on all of this, so far, this has been our reach. We've been doing work in many different elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, and organizations, universities, and groups that we've been invited, even like a group of artists, plastic artists, I think, that they invited us to have a conversation about this. So we reached to 10 different states in the US, and so far 8 different countries as well. And as part of the research side of things, we are right now currently working based on an internship as well, supporting the creation of indigenous ingredients database. We are going to be working on different research related to traditional ways of seed keeping, foraging techniques, hunting, fishing, and the ways of sharing and stuff. And very soon we're going to start also with likely with another internship that is going to be working on the cultural plant and animal profiles that we're calling it, where it's developing these small packages of information about different indigenous ingredients. And that's all I have for you. So I'm hoping that kind of made sense to all of you, and I'd be happy to hear if you have some comments or questions. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you for letting me do this and be here. And yeah, I'm open to your questions or whatever. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now.
Great, thank you, Armando. That was a lot of information, and it was great to kind of see all the different places you've been. We have a few questions coming up, so I will just read them out loud. The first one is, what are the 3 items grown in the Three Sisters Mound?
They are corn, beans, and squash.
Okay, great. Do they change, or is that usually what the 3 items are?
Those are the traditional 3 ones. That's the most common practice. Depending on the region, it might vary the variety of beans or the variety of squash, or or it's even the variety of corn. But those 3 are the ones that are always together.
Great. Another question that came in is, have you witnessed obesity and adult onset diabetes much more commonly in Native cultures on modern diets? We see it in America, but not sure about Southern Native cultures.
Yes, I agree that we see it more in North America, and I haven't seen it as strongly as it is in North America in other parts. But having said that, depending on the region and depending on the closeness, I guess, from the indigenous groups to the more urban settings, that has I think a strong correlation with it. Because I worked in some areas that are very, very remote, like those villages I worked in Bolivia, for instance. It's from the city of La Paz, it took me about a week just to get to some of the villages, taking a plane, then taking a little boat, a little bus, and then you have to take a canoe for 3 days and things like that, you know, so they're really, really remote. Over there, I haven't seen any type of obesity. But in other settings, like in some of the areas that I worked in Mexico, they were very close to the city of Oaxaca, for instance. The villages there, they had, because of that, a little more access. And the government has like different type of programs that offer this more westernized foods, if you want. So I could see that there was some kind of correlation with it, you know, so there was a little bit more obesity in that sense. But again, in Guatemala, I worked in an area that it's fairly remote as well. It's not very close. The closest city is at least 5-6 hours driving. And there's, yeah, no, you don't see much of that. I think it's more prevalent here in the US.
Mm-hmm. Another question, how does NATIFS define Indigenous, particularly given the long history of cultural mixing, exchange, and migration for most cultures throughout the world?
Yeah, that is a question. That's a very difficult question because I don't think there's like a specific direct answer for it, because those are some of the things that we're working on. Like I said, like we are offering even these internal workshops. And as part of that, recently we were working on a workshop in which we were discussing again the whole idea, whole approach of how do we understand foodways and how do we understand indigenous foodways and what indigenous means, what indigeneity means and all of that. So it's something that we have to keep a little bit of an open mind because there are different approaches to it. Like I said, our staff, most of our staff is Native American and they come from different tribes and they have their own approaches as well to this. So we are very aware and open to engage in these conversations and discussions and find a way to, I don't know, to kind of define it in a way that it's a little dynamic as well, that it's more flexible. You know, we're not just close into something very specific. I'm sorry, I know I'm not really fully answering that question, but yeah, it's because it's difficult to say exactly because we are a very diverse group as well, and we're trying to be open to listen to all the approaches first to be able to discuss that for further.
Great, thank you. Another question, how do you source ingredients for your soups?
Most of the ingredients, as much as we can, we get them from Native American producers. Obviously, we cannot get all of it from Native American producers, unfortunately, but we are hoping to keep growing that. So we are making connections with all the tribes, all the people, or the contacts that we have, and we are developing more because we want to be able to source everything from Native American producers. But also we're working with local farmers, local organizations like Dream of Wild Health, for instance. There's a really wonderful organization also based here in Minneapolis that they have a farm and they produce really wonderful indigenous ingredients as well there. So we're sourcing some of it from them as well. So it's a little bit from here and there, you know, from different parts, but as much as possible, we are focusing on local producers and when possible, Native American producers directly. And as part of the education program as well, we are trying to develop this this path, you know, so we can have a path with some of the communities in which we can support them as well to develop the program in which they can become producers as well for organizations such as us or others in general, you know, and start producing their own ways in following their own agricultural techniques and all of that.
Great. We only have time for one more question. So the last one is, Is part of your goal to encourage the embracing of indigenous food to shift food production to more environmentally sound farming practices? How does this scale, or will most of this be based locally?
Well, yes, our hope is just that, to encourage more people to share everything we're doing and show to people that talking about indigenous foods, indigenous foodways, it's a really good way to go. It's a really good approach. It makes sense for the environment, it makes sense for our health, but it makes sense also culturally because it's culturally appropriate in the region you are and all of that. And as part of that, we are initiating some conversations, and that's why we participated in some panels and stuff to engage on bigger conversations related to food sovereignty, for instance. We are trying to reach out to bigger groups such as La Via Campesina, for instance, that it's a really big organization that supports indigenous food sovereignty globally around the world. So we want to work with them as well as much as possible. And everybody who is interested, you know, local farmers, local producers, every person that wants to engage in this, that's why we're developing different materials so they can come join us in the conversation and understand that to participate on this, to focus on a healthy diet, on indigenous food and all of that, foodways, you don't have to be an expert. You just have to be interested, and you just have to care about the land, care about the people, and we can all this do together. You know, we have to.
Great. Thank you. So it is 1:01. I know we still have a few more questions, but hopefully we can connect with you later to answer those. So if you have any additional questions, please feel free to email us. I will now let Deb tell us about our next Lunch and Learn. And I want to thank you, Armando, again for your wonderful presentation.
No, it was a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
I want to thank you as well. That was so interesting, and I really, really appreciate the holistic approach you're taking to food. Food is a complex issue, and it's the thing that binds us all together. So it was a wonderful presentation. For everyone on the call, our next Lunch and Learn will be Recreate Responsibly on April 21st from noon till 1. To learn more about that Lunch and Learn, please visit our website at stcroixriverassociation.org. And I'd like to thank you all for attending, and thank you so much for NATIFS and Armando. Enjoy the wonderful St. Patty's Day.